Flight 447 departed from Denver International Airport at 6:15 p.m. on a crisp October evening. The 737 carried 143 passengers and 6 crew members, all bound for Seattle. Among the passengers was Staff Sergeant Maria, 28, who sat quietly in seat 14C, wearing civilian clothes but carrying herself with the unmistakable posture of military training. Maria had just completed a 2-week leave visiting her family in Colorado. Her grandmother had celebrated her 85th birthday, and Maria treasured every moment spent listening to stories about their family's journey from Mexico to America. As the plane climbed through the evening sky, she gazed out the small window, thinking about returning to her unit at Joint Base Lewiscord. Captain James Harrison, a veteran pilot with 22 years of experience, guided the aircraft through routine takeoff procedures. His co-pilot, First Officer Sarah, monitored instruments as they reached cruising altitude. The weather report showed clear skies ahead, and both pilots expected an uneventful 2-hour flight. In the passenger cabin, flight attendant Karen began her usual service routine. She noticed the young woman in 14C seemed different from other passengers. There was something about her alertness, the way her eyes constantly scanned the cabin, that suggested training beyond civilian life. When Karen offered her a beverage, Maria politely declined, explaining she preferred to stay sharp during flights. The first hour passed peacefully. Passengers settled into their routines, some reading, others watching downloaded movies on their devices, children playing games. Business travelers typed on laptops while elderly couples shared magazines. Maria spent her time observing, a habit ingrained through years of military service. She noticed the flight attendants' movements, emergency exit locations, and fellow passengers' behaviors. As they flew over the Rocky Mountains, the aircraft encountered its first turbulence. Nothing unusual, just enough bumping to cause nervous passengers to grip their armrests. Captain Harrison announced over the intercom that they were experiencing light chop and advised everyone to keep fastened. Maria felt the plane's movements differently than other passengers. Her trained senses picked up subtle changes in engine sounds, the aircraft's rhythm, small variations that civilian passengers wouldn't notice. Something felt slightly off, though she couldn't identify exactly what. She decided to trust her instincts and remained alert. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples as they crossed into Utah airspace. Below, mountain peaks cast long shadows across valleys. Other passengers marveled at the view, but Maria continued her quiet surveillance, watching crew members' faces for signs of concern. First Officer noticed an unusual reading on one of her instruments, a slight irregularity in the hydraulic system pressure. She mentioned it to Captain Harrison, who checked his own displays. The reading fluctuated between normal and slightly low, not immediately dangerous, but worth monitoring. "Keep an eye on that," Harrison told quietly. "If it drops below minimum, we'll need to consider diversion options." Neither pilot was overly concerned at this point. Modern aircraft have multiple redundant systems, and slight pressure variations sometimes occurred without incident. They continued monitoring while maintaining their course towards Seattle. In the cabin, Maria noticed one of the flight attendants, a young man named David, walking more frequently between the galley and cockpit than usual. His movements seemed purposeful rather than routine service-related. Her military training had taught her to recognize when people were communicating information they didn't want to broadcast publicly. As they entered Idaho airspace, the hydraulic pressure reading dropped noticeably. Captain Harrison and First Officer began running through their emergency checklists, still maintaining calm professionalism. They contacted air traffic control to advise of their situation and request priority handling upon arrival in Seattle. "Seattle approach, this is United 447. We're experiencing minor hydraulic irregularities and requesting priority approach when ready," Harrison radioed. The air traffic controller acknowledged their request and began preparing for their arrival. At this point, the situation remained manageable, a precautionary measure rather than an emergency declaration. Passengers remained unaware of the developing situation. The crew maintained normal service, though attentive observers might have noticed slightly increased activity in the galley area. Flight attendants quietly reviewed emergency procedures without alarming anyone. Maria continued watching. She noticed David make another trip to the cockpit, staying longer this time. When he returned, his expression had changed subtly. She'd seen that look before in combat zones, controlled concern mixed with professional determination. The aircraft began a slight descent as they approached the Cascade Mountains. Captain Harrison decided to start their approach to Seattle earlier than planned, giving themselves extra time and altitude to work with if the hydraulic situation worsened. "Ladies, and from the flight deck," Harrison announced. "We're beginning our descent into the Seattle area. Current weather is clear with light winds, and we expect an on-time arrival. Please ensure your fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions." His voice remained calm and professional, revealing nothing about the developing mechanical issue. Years of training had taught him to maintain passenger confidence while dealing with potential problems. As the plane descended through 25,000 feet, the hydraulic pressure dropped again, more significantly this time. Warning lights illuminated on the instrument panel, and both pilots immediately began running through more comprehensive emergency checklists. "We need to declare an emergency," Harrison told. "Start the preparation procedures." First officer contacted Seattle Approach with their situation update. "Seattle Approach, United 447 declaring emergency. We have hydraulic system failure and are requesting immediate priority handling and emergency vehicles standing by." The air traffic controller's voice remained professional despite the gravity of the situation. "United 447, emergency declared. You're cleared direct to Seattle, maintain present heading. Emergency vehicles are being dispatched." In the cabin, passengers began noticing changes. The descent felt steeper than normal, and some experienced ears popping from rapid altitude changes. A few nervous flyers gripped their armrests, sensing something different about this approach. Maria's training kicked into higher alert. The aircraft's behavior confirmed her earlier instincts that something wasn't right. She began mentally reviewing everything she knew about emergency procedures, aircraft systems, and crisis management. Flight attendants received notification through their internal communication system about the situation. They began discreetly preparing for emergency landing procedures while maintaining calm appearances. Their training emphasized keeping passengers calm while being ready for any eventuality. As the plane continued its descent towards Seattle, the hydraulic failure worsened. Control systems that normally operated smoothly began requiring more effort from the pilots. Captain Harrison and First Officer worked together, compensating for the degrading systems while maintaining aircraft stability. "We're losing more hydraulic pressure," reported, monitoring her instruments carefully. "Backup systems are compensating, but we're going to have limited control authority for landing." Harrison nodded grimly. "Start emergency landing preparations. Brief the flight attendants on our situation." The mountain peaks of the Cascades passed below as Flight 447 approached what would become one of the most challenging landings either pilot had ever attempted. In Seat 14C, Staff Sergeant Maria prepared for whatever was coming next, her military training already shifting into emergency mode. The cabin suddenly filled with an ominous mechanical grinding sound that made several passengers look up from their activities with concern. In the cockpit, Captain Harrison struggled with the controls as another hydraulic system failed completely. Red warning lights illuminated the instrument panel like a Christmas tree, each one representing a critical system now operating on backup power or manual control. "Sarah, we've lost the primary and secondary hydraulic systems," Harrison announced to his co-pilot, his voice tense but controlled. "We're running on manual backup only. This is going to be extremely difficult." First Officer's hands moved rapidly across the control panel. Following emergency procedures she had practiced countless times in simulators, but never hoped to use in real flight. "Emergency checklist complete. I'm notifying the cabin crew to prepare for emergency landing procedures." The plane shuddered as Harrison fought to maintain level flight. Without hydraulic assistance, every control input required enormous physical strength. His arms already ached from wrestling with the unresponsive controls, and they still had 20 minutes before reaching Seattle. In the passenger cabin, flight attendant David received the emergency notification through his headset. His face went pale as he absorbed the gravity of their situation. He immediately contacted his colleagues and began preparing for what could become a crash landing. "Ladies, and this is your lead flight attendant speaking," David announced over the intercom, his voice carefully controlled. We are experiencing some mechanical difficulties and will be making an emergency landing in Seattle. Please listen carefully to safety instructions and remain calm. The cabin erupted in nervous murmurs and anxious conversations. Some passengers began crying, while others frantically tried to call family members on their phones. Parents pulled their children closer, and business travelers stopped working to focus on the unfolding emergency. Maria felt her military training take complete control. While other passengers panicked, she became hyper-alert, processing every detail of the situation. She noticed how the aircraft was behaving, the unsteady movements, the way the pilots were clearly fighting for control, the increasing steepness of their descent. "Attention everyone," Flight Attendant Karen announced. "We need you to assume crash landing positions immediately. Place your head between your knees, hands over your head. Remove all sharp objects, glasses, and jewelry. Make sure you're as tight as possible." The demonstration that followed was unlike the routine safety briefings passengers typically ignored. This time, everyone paid desperate attention as the flight crew showed proper bracing positions, explained how to find life vests, and pointed out emergency exits. Maria noticed something troubling during the safety demonstration. The flight attendants, despite their professional training, showed signs of serious concern. Their movements were more urgent than normal emergency drills, and she caught fearful glances exchanged between crew members. As the plane continued its troubled descent towards Seattle, the situation in the cockpit deteriorated further. Captain Harrison's arms screamed in pain as he fought the controls, and sweat poured down his face despite the air conditioning. First Officer worked frantically through emergency procedures while maintaining radio contact with air traffic control. "Seattle Tower, United 447. We have complete hydraulic failure and are attempting emergency landing on runway 16L. Request foam trucks and medical personnel standing by. We have 149 souls on board and approximately 45 minutes of fuel remaining." The air traffic controller's voice came back immediately. "United 447, runway 16L is cleared for emergency approach. All fire and rescue equipment is standing by. Medical helicopters are en route. You are cleared for any approach path necessary." In the passenger cabin, panic was beginning to overwhelm some travelers. A middle-aged businessman in the front row hyperventilated while his wife tried to calm him down. Two teenagers near the back of the plane sobbed uncontrollably. An elderly woman clutched her rosary beads and prayed audibly in Spanish. Maria watched the chaos around her with tactical assessment. Her years of military service had exposed her to crisis situations where clear thinking meant the difference between life and death. She began formulating contingency plans, identifying passengers who might need assistance, and noting potential obstacles to evacuation. The aircraft lurched violently to the left as Captain Harrison lost momentary control. Overhead bins popped open, spilling luggage and personal items into the aisles. Screams filled the cabin as passengers were thrown against their seats despite. "Everyone stay in your seats and keep those belts tight," David shouted over the chaos. "Do not attempt to retrieve any fallen items. Focus on maintaining proper crash positions." Maria noticed that several passengers were not following instructions properly. Fear had paralyzed their ability to think clearly. An obese man in the aisle seat couldn't get his head down properly. A young mother was more concerned with comforting her crying baby than securing herself. The mountain landscape below grew larger as they descended rapidly towards Seattle. Captain Harrison realized their approach was becoming increasingly unstable. Without hydraulic controls, maintaining proper glide path and airspeed was nearly impossible. "Sarah, I don't think we're going to make it to sea," Harrison said grimly. "We're losing altitude too fast and I'm having trouble controlling our descent rate. We might need to find an alternative landing site." First Officer scanned her instruments and consulted approach charts. "There's field about 10 miles southeast of sea. Shorter runway, but it might be more accessible given our current position and descent rate. Contact them immediately. Tell them we're diverting for emergency landing." The radio crackled as made contact with Field Tower. "Field Tower, this is United 447 declaring emergency. We are diverting from sea due to complete hydraulic failure. Request immediate clearance for emergency landing." United 447, Field Tower. Runway 14R is available. We're clearing all traffic and activating emergency response. What is your current position and estimated arrival? Back in the cabin, the announcement of their diversion sent new waves of anxiety through the passengers. Many had family waiting at Sea Airport, and the change suggested their situation was more serious than initially indicated. Maria continued her assessment of the passenger cabin. She noticed that the flight attendants were now visibly struggling to maintain their composure. Karen, hands shook as she checked passengers, and David kept glancing toward the cockpit with obvious concern. The plane suddenly dropped several hundred feet, causing that terrifying sensation of weightlessness that makes stomachs leap into throats. Emergency oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments, dangling like yellow lifelines throughout the cabin. "Put your oxygen masks on immediately," David commanded over the intercom. "Place the mask over your nose and mouth, pull the elastic strap over your head, and breathe normally. If you are traveling with children, secure your own mask first, then assist them." Maria quickly secured her oxygen mask while observing other passengers. Many fumbled with the unfamiliar equipment, struggling to get proper seals. She noticed an elderly man 3 seats away couldn't get his mask positioned correctly and was beginning to show signs of oxygen deprivation. The aircraft's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. Captain Harrison was using every ounce of his strength and experience to keep them airborne, but he was fighting a losing battle against failing systems and the fundamental laws of physics. "Sarah, we're not going to make field either," Harrison announced grimly. "We're losing too much altitude too quickly. Look for any open ground, a highway, large parking lot, anything flat and long enough." First officer frantically scanned the terrain below through her window and consulted emergency landing charts. The Seattle metropolitan area stretched out below them, a maze of buildings, highways, and residential neighborhoods. "There's Interstate 5 about 2 miles ahead," reported. "4 lanes, relatively straight section, light traffic. It's our best option." Harrison keyed his radio for what might be his final transmission. All stations, this is United 447. We are attempting emergency landing on Interstate 5 approximately 5 miles south of field. This is not a drill. We have complete hydraulic failure and are unable to reach any airport." In the passenger cabin, this final announcement created an atmosphere of absolute terror. The reality that they were going to attempt landing on a highway rather than an airport made the gravity of their situation undeniable. Maria watched as complete panic threatened to overwhelm the cabin. She knew from her military experience that group panic could be as deadly as any mechanical failure. People needed leadership, direction, and hope if they were going to have any chance of surviving what was coming next. The young woman in seat 14C began to realize that her unique training and experience might be desperately needed in the next few minutes. The intercom crackled to life with Captain Harrison's voice, now strained with exhaustion and barely controlled fear. "Ladies and, this is your captain speaking. I need everyone to listen very carefully. We are going to attempt an emergency landing in approximately 3 minutes. Assume crash positions immediately and do not move until the aircraft comes to a complete stop." His next words sent chills through every person on board. "Brace for crash landing, brace for crash landing." The cabin erupted into chaos. Passengers screamed, cried, and prayed in multiple languages. A businessman near the front unbuckled his and tried to run toward the back of the plane, causing flight attendant David to physically restrain him. 2 children in the middle section wailed uncontrollably while their parents struggled to help them into proper positions. Maria watched the pandemonium around her with growing concern. Her military training had taught her that panic was contagious and deadly. In combat situations, she had seen how quickly group hysteria could turn manageable crises into catastrophic disasters. The aircraft shuddered violently as Captain Harrison fought to line up with Interstate 5. Through her window, Maria could see cars on the highway below, tiny dots that would soon become very real obstacles. She realized that even if they survived the initial impact, the aftermath could be equally dangerous without proper leadership. Flight attendant Karen stumbled past Maria's row, tears streaming down her face as she tried to help passengers prepare for impact. Her training was comprehensive, but nothing had fully prepared her for the reality of an actual crash landing with complete system failures. "Karen," Maria called out firmly, catching the flight attendant's attention. "I need to tell you something important." Karen stopped, recognizing something different in Maria's voice. an authority and calmness that cut through the surrounding chaos. "I'm military," Maria said quickly. "Special operations training, crisis management, emergency response. If we survive this landing, you're going to need help managing evacuation and casualties. I can assist." Karen's eyes widened with a mixture of relief and hope. "Are you a pilot?" "Helicopter pilot, actually. Fixed-wing certified. Not current on commercial aircraft, but I understand aviation systems and emergency procedures." Before Karen could respond, the plane lurched dramatically to the right. Captain Harrison's voice came over the intercom again, this time edged with desperation. "I'm losing control of the aircraft. Flight attendants, prepare for impact in 90 seconds." The announcement triggered a new wave of hysteria. An elderly woman in the aisle began hyperventilating. A young father couldn't get his 5-year-old daughter into proper crash position. A businessman was frantically trying to call his wife on his cell phone instead of preparing for impact. Maria made a split-second decision that would change everything. She unbuckled her and stood up in the aisle, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of military command. "Everyone listen to me right now," she shouted above the chaos, her voice cutting through the screams and panic like a sword. "My name is Staff Sergeant, United States Army. I am a trained pilot, and I need everyone to do exactly what I tell you if you want to survive this." The cabin fell into stunned silence. Passengers turned to stare at the young woman standing calmly in the aisle while their aircraft plummeted toward the ground. "First, everyone make it tight enough that you can barely breathe. Second, remove your shoes immediately. They'll come off during impact and become projectiles. Third, empty your pockets of everything: hard pens, phones, keys, coins. Those items become bullets during a crash." Her commands were clear, specific, and delivered with such confidence that passengers began following them automatically. The middle-aged businessman stopped trying to make phone calls and started removing his shoes. The young mother helped her daughter take off her sneakers. "You," Maria pointed to a teenage boy near the emergency exit. "What's your name?" "Tyler," the boy answered, his voice shaking. "Tyler, you're going to be my assistant for the exit door. When we land, you do not touch that handle until I tell you. The door weighs 40 pounds, and if you panic, people will die. Do you understand?" Tyler nodded vigorously, suddenly having a sense of purpose instead of helpless terror. Maria continued moving through the cabin with practiced efficiency. "Ma'am," she addressed the elderly woman who had been hyperventilating, "I need you to count backwards from 100 by sevens. It will help you breathe and stay conscious. Start now, 193.86. The mathematical exercise forced the woman to focus and regulated her breathing immediately. Flight attendant David approached Maria with obvious relief. "What can I do to help?" "Get to the rear exits and be ready to open them the moment we stop moving. Don't wait for instructions from the cockpit. If they're alive, they'll be dealing with other emergencies. You're responsible for the back half of the plane." Maria moved toward the front of the cabin, her confidence infectious. Passengers who had been paralyzed with fear began following her instructions automatically. Her presence transformed the chaotic environment into something approaching organized preparation. "Listen carefully," she announced to the entire cabin. "In about 60 seconds, this aircraft is going to hit the ground hard. Your body wants to tense up, but that will cause more injuries. Stay loose, keep your head down, and when we stop moving, you get up and move toward the nearest exit immediately. Do not stop for luggage, do not look for personal items, do not hesitate." Through the aircraft windows, passengers could now see individual cars on Interstate 5 below. The reality of their situation was undeniable, but Maria's leadership had transformed panic into focused preparation. "You with the baby?" Maria called to the young mother. "What's your name?" "Sarah, this is Emma. She's only 6 months old." "Sarah, you're going to need both hands for evacuation. Use your belt to secure Emma against your chest. Make sure her head is protected, but she can breathe. You'll exit right behind me." Maria's systematic approach to the emergency was working. Instead of 149 individuals panicking separately, the passengers were beginning to function as a coordinated group with clear roles and expectations. The aircraft's descent angle steepened dramatically. Captain Harrison was clearly struggling to maintain any semblance of controlled flight. Through the cockpit door, which flight attendants had left open, passengers could see both pilots wrestling with controls that barely responded to their inputs. 30 seconds, Maria announced calmly. Everyone double-check your position. Head down, hands over your head. When we hit, there will be multiple impacts, the initial touchdown, possibly bouncing, sliding, and finally stopping. Do not move until everything is completely still. She looked toward the cockpit, where Captain Harrison and First Officer were using every ounce of their strength and skill to give their passengers the best possible chance of survival. "Ma'am," Flight Attendant Karen called out urgently, "should you get back to your seat?" Maria shook her head. "I'm staying mobile. If the cockpit crew is incapacitated, someone needs to be able to coordinate evacuation immediately. I'll brace right here in the aisle." The ground rushed up toward them with terrifying speed. Cars on Interstate 5 were swerving to avoid the approaching aircraft. Maria could see emergency vehicles racing along parallel roads, their lights flashing in the afternoon sunlight. "Brace, brace, brace!" Captain Harrison's voice came over the intercom one final time. Maria dropped to the aisle floor in a protective position, but kept her head up enough to monitor the cabin. Around her, 148 passengers and 5 flight attendants prepared for impact, their fate now completely in the hands of physics, pilot skill, and whatever luck remained to them. In the cockpit, Captain Harrison lined up as best he could with a straight section of highway. Cars scattered ahead of them as drivers spotted the descending airliner. He had one chance to get this right. The wheels of United Flight 447 touched Interstate 5 at 180 miles per hour, beginning an emergency landing that would test every aspect of Maria's military training and leadership abilities. The impact was unlike anything the passengers had ever experienced. Flight 447 slammed into Interstate 5 with tremendous force, the landing gear collapsing immediately upon contact with the asphalt. The aircraft bounced twice, each impact throwing passengers violently against their restraints before beginning a terrifying slide down the highway. Sparks flew from the aircraft's belly as it scraped along the concrete at over 100 miles per hour. The right wing clipped an overpass support, spinning the plane partially sideways before it continued sliding. Inside the cabin, overhead bins burst open, raining luggage and debris onto the passengers below. Maria, braced in the aisle, felt her body slam against the floor with each bounce and impact. Despite the chaos around her, she maintained her focus, watching for signs of structural failure, fire, or other immediate threats. Her military training had prepared her for situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. The aircraft finally came to rest after sliding nearly half a mile, coming to a stop just short of a major intersection. For a moment, an eerie silence filled the cabin. The sudden absence of engine noise, grinding metal, and screaming passengers created an almost surreal quiet. Then reality crashed back as passengers began crying out in pain and fear. Several people were unconscious. Blood trickled from various cuts and injuries, and the acrid smell of fuel and burning electronics filled the air. Maria was on her feet instantly, her training taking complete control. "Everyone stay in your seats for 10 seconds while I assess damage," she shouted, her voice cutting through the moans and confusion. "Do not move yet. We need to make sure the aircraft is stable." She quickly scanned the cabin for immediate threats. No sign of fire yet, but she could smell jet fuel, which meant they had limited time before the situation could become catastrophic. Several windows had cracked but not completely failed. Most importantly, the emergency exits appeared intact and accessible. "Tyler," she called to the teenager she had assigned to help with the emergency exit, "are you conscious?" "Yes, ma'am," Tyler replied, his voice shaky but alert. "Good. Flight attendants, report your status." Karen struggled to her feet from where she had been thrown against a seat. "I'm okay. David is unconscious but breathing. The other attendants are checking in." Maria moved quickly toward the cockpit to check on the pilots. Captain Harrison was slumped over the controls, blood running from a gash on his forehead, but his eyes were open. First Officer was conscious but clearly dazed. "Captain, can you hear me?" Maria asked urgently. "Yes," Harrison replied weakly. "Engines are shut down, but we have fuel leak warnings. You need to get everyone out immediately." Maria didn't need to be told twice. She turned back to the passenger cabin and took charge of the evacuation with military precision. "Listen up, everyone. We are evacuating this aircraft right now. You will move in an orderly fashion to the nearest exit. Do not stop for anything. Do not go back for luggage. Do not help anyone who appears seriously injured. Trained personnel will handle medical emergencies. She pointed to specific passengers. And you help the elderly woman in row 8. You two men in business suits assist the man who's unconscious in row 12. Move him carefully, but move him now. The organized evacuation began immediately. Maria had transformed a potentially chaotic and deadly situation into a coordinated rescue operation. She stationed herself at the main exit, helping passengers as they moved toward safety. "Ma'am, I can't find my purse," an elderly passenger said, stopping in the aisle. "Leave it," Maria commanded firmly. "Your life is more important than anything in that purse. Keep moving." Outside the aircraft, emergency vehicles were arriving from multiple directions. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars surrounded Flight 447, their crews preparing for the worst. The fact that the plane had remained intact and showed no signs of fire gave first responders hope that casualties might be minimal. Inside the cabin, Maria continued coordinating the evacuation while simultaneously assessing passengers for injuries. A businessman had a broken arm, a young mother had severe cuts from flying glass, and several passengers showed signs of concussion, but most were walking under their own power. "Tyler, open the emergency exit now," Maria instructed. The teenager, following her earlier guidance, operated the exit door properly and deployed the emergency slide. Passengers began sliding to safety, where paramedics and firefighters waited to assist them. The evacuation proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Within 8 minutes of the aircraft coming to rest, Maria had helped evacuate over 100 passengers. The smell of fuel was getting stronger, and she knew they were running out of time before the risk of fire became critical. "Karen, get Captain Harrison out of there," Maria called to the flight attendant. "I'll handle the last passengers." About 20 passengers remained in the aircraft, most of them injured or helping others who couldn't move independently. Maria made quick triage decisions, prioritizing those who could be moved safely while ensuring no one was left behind. A middle-aged woman was trapped in her seat by debris from the overhead bin. Maria quickly assessed the situation and began moving luggage and broken plastic panels. "What's your name?" she asked while working. "Is my husband okay? He was sitting next to me." "He's already outside and safe. I need you to stay calm while I get you free." Maria's voice remained steady and reassuring even as she worked frantically to clear the debris. The smell of fuel was becoming overwhelming. Emergency responders outside were shouting for everyone to evacuate immediately. Maria freed and helped her toward the exit, but there were still 6 passengers left in the aircraft. An unconscious man in the back rows was too heavy for one person to move safely. Maria recruited 2 other passengers to help carry him toward the exit. "On my count 1, 2, lift. Keep his neck stable." As they moved the injured passenger, Maria heard a sound that made her blood run cold, the crackling of electrical fire somewhere in the aircraft systems. They had minutes, maybe less, before the situation became unsurvivable. "Everyone out right now," she commanded, abandoning the careful evacuation pace for urgent speed. The last few passengers moved quickly toward the exits while Maria did one final sweep of the cabin to ensure no one was left behind. Fire trucks outside began spraying foam on the aircraft as small flames became visible near the right wing. Maria reached the emergency exit just as the first real flames erupted from the aircraft's electrical systems. She was the last person to slide down the emergency chute to safety. As her feet hit the ground, firefighters immediately pulled her away from the aircraft as flames spread rapidly through the cabin they had just evacuated. All 149 people on board Flight 447 had survived. 37 passengers required hospitalization for various injuries, but there were no fatalities. Captain Harrison suffered a concussion and broken ribs. First officer had a dislocated shoulder. The most seriously injured passenger was the businessman with the broken arm, who also had internal injuries from the impact. As Maria sat in the back of an ambulance receiving treatment for cuts and bruises, she watched the aircraft burn completely. The 737 that had carried them safely through a hydraulic failure and impossible landing was now a twisted mass of metal and flames. Captain Harrison, despite his injuries, sought out Maria before being transported to the hospital. "Sergeant, what you did in there saved lives. I've been flying for 22 years, and I've never seen anything like your leadership during that evacuation. Local and national news crews arrived within hours to cover the miraculous survival of all passengers in what aviation experts were already calling one of the most challenging emergency landings in commercial aviation history. When reporters asked Captain Harrison about the successful evacuation, he immediately credited the soldier in 14C who took charge when we needed leadership most. Maria returned to her unit at Joint Base Louisbourg 3 days later, after ensuring all passengers from Flight 447 had received proper medical care. She received commendations from both the Army and civilian aviation authorities for her actions during the emergency. The investigation into Flight 447's hydraulic failure led to important safety improvements in 737 systems. Captain Harrison and First Officer were recognized for their extraordinary piloting skills under impossible conditions. For Maria, the experience reinforced everything she had learned about leadership, crisis management, and the importance of staying calm when others depend on you. She had boarded Flight 447 as a soldier returning from leave. She landed as a hero who had helped save 149 lives through courage, training, and split-second decision-making. The young woman who had quietly observed her fellow passengers during a routine flight had become their salvation when everything went wrong. Her military training, combined with natural leadership abilities and unshakable composure under pressure, had transformed a potential catastrophe into a story of survival and heroism that would be remembered in aviation history. Years later, when Maria was asked about that October evening, she would say that she simply did what her training had prepared her to do. But for 148 other people, her actions that day meant the difference between going home to their families and becoming another aviation tragedy statistic.